In 1872, the dusty streets of Larkspur Ridge knew only two kinds of people, those who owned everything and those who owned nothing. Evelyn Van Cleef was the richest woman in 3 counties, a railroad heiress whose fortune was built on Chinese labor and broken dreams. She had everything money could buy, but had forgotten what it meant to truly live. On a grey October afternoon, she made a purchase that would change everything. Not land, not stock, a man. Li Wei, a young Chinese laborer condemned to servitude, became her property with a single bid. She brought him to her mansion as just another servant, another transaction in her cold, calculated world. But Li Wei was different. Behind his quiet demeanor lay a wisdom that would slowly crack open her hardened heart. He saw through her wealth to the lonely woman beneath, and when danger threatened everything she'd built, he would risk his freedom to save her. What happens when the person you own becomes the one who sets you free? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Van Cleef mansion perched on Larkspur Ridge like a crown jewel, its white columns and sprawling verandas, a testament to wealth built on steel rails and human sweat. From her study window on the 2nd floor, Evelyn could see the entire town spread below the saloons and boarding houses, the rail yards where Chinese workers bent their backs under the autumn sun, and beyond it all, the mountains that held both promise and peril. She twisted the thin gold band on her finger, a habit that had persisted through 3 years of widowhood. The ring was all that remained of Jonathan Van Cleef, her husband of barely 2 years before consumption claimed him. Everything else, the railroad empire, the mansion, the fear and respect that followed her name, had been her creation alone. Mrs. Van Cleef, Martha Hendricks, her housekeeper, appeared in the doorway with the practiced silence of someone who had served the wealthy for decades. Her greying hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her eyes held the warmth that Evelyn had long forgotten how to express. "The morning reports are on your desk." Evelyn turned from the window, her black silk dress rustling softly. Even 3 years after Jonathan's death, she maintained the widow's colours, though whether from grief or habit, she could no longer say. "Thank you, Martha, and Clara." "Still abed, I'm afraid." The nightmares came again last night. Martha's voice carried the gentle concern of a woman who had helped raise the child since her parents' death in a railroad accident 2 years prior. She was calling for her mother. The familiar weight of responsibility settled on Evelyn's shoulders. Clara, her brother's daughter, had become her ward when fever took both her parents within a week of each other. The girl was 8 now, precocious and bright, but haunted by losses too heavy for such young shoulders. "I'll speak with her after breakfast," Evelyn said, settling behind her massive oak desk. The morning reports lay spread before her: productivity numbers from the rail yards, financial statements from her various holdings, and requests for audiences from men who feared her more than they respected her. They called her the China Widow, though never to her face. The name carried layers of meaning in Larkspur Ridge. Widow for her obvious state, China for her willingness to profit from Chinese labor when other railroad owners preferred Irish or German workers. The Chinese worked harder for less pay, asked fewer questions, and caused less trouble. It was simply good business. But there was another layer to the name, one that made respectable women cross themselves when they passed her carriage. She had power in a world that belonged to men, and she wielded it without apology. The town needed her. Her railroad brought prosperity. Her investments supported local businesses, but they feared what she represented. A woman who had transcended the boundaries of her sex through sheer force of will. Evelyn opened the first report, her eyes scanning the columns of numbers with practiced efficiency. The western expansion was proceeding ahead of schedule, though labor costs were rising. There had been some trouble with claim jumpers near the new line, and Thomas Hartwell's competing railroad had been making aggressive moves to secure mineral rights in the same territory. Hartwell. The name left a bitter taste in her mouth. He was everything she despised about her industry: crude, violent, and utterly without conscience. Where she saw the Chinese workers as useful assets to be managed efficiently, he saw them as barely human obstacles to be disposed of when convenient. Their rivalry had grown from simple business competition to something more personal, more dangerous. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Li Wei, standing quietly in the doorway. 3 days had passed since she'd brought him from the auction, and she was still adjusting to his presence in her household. He was perhaps 25, with the lean build of someone accustomed to hard work. But there was something in his posture that spoke of dignity despite his circumstances. "Mrs. Van Cleef," he said, his voice carrying only the faintest trace of accent. "Martha asked me to inform you that breakfast is ready." She looked up from her papers, studying him with the same attention she gave to business proposals. Most of the Chinese workers she employed kept their eyes downcast in her presence, but Li Wei met her gaze steadily. Not with insolence, but with something she found harder to categorize, a quiet strength that suggested he had not been broken by his circumstances. "Thank you," she replied, setting down her pen. "And how are you settling in?" "Very well, thank you. Martha has been most kind in explaining my duties." There was something in his careful politeness that intrigued her. She had expected either servile gratitude or sullen resentment, but Li Wei displayed neither. He seemed to inhabit his role as servant with the same composure another man might wear a tailored suit. "Good. I trust you understand the expectations of this household." "I believe so. Discretion, efficiency, and loyalty." He paused, then added, "Martha emphasized that you value competence above all else." Evelyn found herself almost smiling. Martha had sized up the situation quickly, as she always did. "Martha is a wise woman. You would do well to listen to her counsel." "I intend to." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Walk with me to the dining room. I have questions about your previous experience." They moved through the wide hallways of the mansion, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and windows that looked out over manicured gardens. The house was too large for its current occupants, built for entertaining that rarely happened anymore. Jonathan had been the social one, drawing people to them with his easy charm and generous laugh. After his death, Evelyn had retreated into herself, finding solace in business and power rather than human connection. "Martha tells me you can read and write," she said as they descended the grand staircase. "Yes, ma'am. I was educated at a missionary school in San Francisco before coming to the mountains." "And what brought you to the mountains?" For the first time, she saw a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, or regret cross his features. "Family obligations. My father had debts that needed to be settled." She recognized the tone. It was the same careful neutrality she used when discussing Jonathan's death, the voice of someone who had learned to speak of tragedy without emotion. "I see. And those obligations led you to the auction?" "Eventually, yes." They had reached the dining room, where Martha was arranging fresh flowers in a crystal vase. The older woman looked up with a smile that encompassed both of them. "Good morning, Mrs. Van Cleef. I've prepared your usual breakfast, and I took the liberty of adding some of the pears from the orchard. They're particularly sweet this season." "Thank you, Martha." Evelyn took her seat at the head of the long table, gesturing for Li Wei to wait. "Before you begin your other duties, I want you to take a look at the garden behind the house. It's been neglected since the gardener left last spring, and I'm curious about your assessment of what might be salvaged." "Of course, ma'am." "Mrs. Van Cleef?" A small voice from the doorway interrupted them. Clara stood there in her nightgown, dark hair tangled from sleep, clutching a worn doll to her chest. "I heard voices." Evelyn's expression softened imperceptibly. "Good morning, sweetheart. Come have breakfast with me." The child approached slowly, her eyes darting curiously to Li Wei. She had inherited her father's gentle nature and her mother's quick intelligence, but the losses had made her cautious around strangers. "Clara, this is Li Wei. He's going to be helping Martha with the household duties." Evelyn's voice carried a warmth reserved only for her niece. "Li Wei, this is Miss Clara Van Cleef." Li Wei bowed slightly, a gesture that seemed to delight the child. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Clara." "You talk different," Clara observed with the directness of youth. "Clara," Evelyn warned gently, but Li Wei smiled. "You're quite right. I was born in a place called Guangzhou, very far from here. The way we speak there is different from the way you speak here." "Are you from China?" Clara's eyes widened with interest. "I am. Aunt Evelyn says China is on the other side of the world. Did you come on a ship?" "I did, a very big ship that took many weeks to cross the ocean." Martha cleared her throat gently. "Perhaps we should let Mr. Li Wei attend to his duties while you and your aunt have breakfast." "Of course." Li Wei bowed again to Clara, then to Evelyn. "If you'll excuse me, I'll examine the garden as you requested." As he left, Evelyn found herself watching his retreating figure with unexpected interest. There was something about the way he had interacted with Clara Patient, respectful but not condescending, that impressed her. Most adults either ignored children or spoke to them as if they were simple-minded. "I like him," Clara announced, settling into her chair. "He has kind eyes." "Do you think so?" Evelyn asked, accepting a cup of coffee from Martha. "Yes, they're sad, but kind, like yours." The observation caught Evelyn off guard. She had always prided herself on maintaining strict emotional control, especially in business dealings. To think that even a child could see through her carefully constructed facade was unsettling. "Eat your breakfast, Clara. We have lessons this morning." As the child dutifully began eating her porridge, Evelyn found her thoughts returning to Li Wei. There had been something in his bearing, in the way he spoke, that suggested depths she hadn't expected. Most of the Chinese workers she employed were immigrants with little education, grateful for any work that would keep them alive. But Li Wei was different. His English was too good, his manner too composed. Through the window, she could see him walking through the overgrown garden, stopping occasionally to examine plants or test the soil. He moved with purpose, but also with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the neglected beauty around him. Martha poured more coffee, following her employer's gaze. "He seems different from the others," she said quietly. "How so?" "Educated, thoughtful. He asked about the books in the library, wondered if he might be permitted to read them in his free time." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him?" "That I would ask you, of course. But I got the impression he's accustomed to books, to learning. There's something about him that suggests he's seen better times." "Most of them have," Evelyn replied, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. Li Wei carried himself like a man who had once had position, respect. The question was what had brought him so low, that he ended up on an auction block in a frontier town. "Aunt Evelyn?" Clara's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you going to keep him?" "Keep him?" Li Wei. "Are you going to keep him, or will you sell him again?" The innocent question hit Evelyn like a physical blow. The child's matter-of-fact tone, the casual way she spoke of human beings as possessions to be kept or sold, forced her to confront the reality of what she had done. She had purchased a man, not hired him, not offered him employment, but bought him like livestock. She began, then stopped. How did one explain the complexities of labor contracts and debt servitude to an 8-year-old? How did one justify treating human beings as commodities? "He will stay with us for now, Clara. He has work to do here." "Good. I hope he stays forever." The simplicity of the child's wish struck something deep in Evelyn's chest. Forever. When had she last thought in terms of forever? Her marriage to Jonathan had been cut short by disease. Her parents had died when she was barely older than Clara. Even her business empire, built with such care and determination, felt temporary in the face of men like Hartwell who would gladly destroy everything she had built. But here was this child, this innocent soul who had already lost so much, speaking of forever, with the casual confidence of someone who still believed in permanence. Through the window, Li Wei knelt beside a rose bush, carefully pruning away dead branches with a small knife. His movements were gentle, almost reverent, as if he understood that beneath the neglect lay something worth saving. Perhaps they all did. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke as Li Wei made his way through the neglected garden behind the Van Cleef mansion. 7 days had passed since his arrival, and he had begun to understand the rhythms of this strange household. Martha's efficient kindness, Clara's innocent curiosity, and most puzzling of all, Evelyn Van Cleef herself, a woman who commanded respect through fear, but seemed to have forgotten how to command love. He knelt beside a withered rosebush, examining the thorny stems with practiced eyes. His father had been a scholar, but his mother had tended the most beautiful garden in their district of Guangzhou. From her, he had learned that even the most neglected plants could be coaxed back to life with patience and understanding. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention to the front of the house. Through the hedgerow, he could see a black carriage pulling up the circular drive, its brass fittings gleaming despite the dust of travel. The man who emerged was everything Li Wei had learned to recognize as dangerous in his months among the railroad camps, well dressed, confident, and carrying himself with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to getting his way through violence. Thomas Hartwell had come calling. Li Wei moved quietly through the garden, positioning himself where he could observe without being seen. His years of surviving in situations where knowledge meant the difference between life and death had taught him the value of listening carefully to conversations that were not meant for his ears. Inside the mansion, Evelyn received her unexpected guest in the formal parlor, her spine straight and her expression carefully neutral. Hartwell was a large man, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, with graying hair and small eyes that missed nothing. He had removed his hat, but not his gloves, a deliberate slight that suggested this was not a social call. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite and not a degree more. "This is unexpected. Business doesn't wait for formal invitations, Evelyn." He settled into a chair without being invited, his bulk making the delicate furniture seem suddenly fragile. "I trust you're well." "Quite well, thank you. Martha, would you bring coffee for Mr. Hartwell?" She waited until the housekeeper had withdrawn before continuing. "To what do I owe this visit?" Hartwell smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I've been hearing interesting stories about your recent activities. Something about a purchase at the labor auction last week." Evelyn's face revealed nothing. "I occasionally require additional household staff. Surely that's not worthy of your attention." "Depends on the staff, doesn't it?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a confidential tone. "Evelyn, we've known each other for years. Our businesses have competed, certainly, but I've always respected your pragmatic approach to labor management. That's why I'm concerned about this latest development." "I'm afraid I don't follow." "The Chinaman you bought. Word is he's not like the usual coolies, educated, articulate. Some of my associates think he might be more than he appears." Through the window, Li Wei stiffened. Hartwell's intelligence network was apparently more extensive than he had hoped. "And what do your associates think he might be?" Evelyn asked, her tone carefully modulated. "A spy. Maybe working for the imperial government, maybe for rival railroad interests. Either way, the kind of man who could cause significant problems if he's gathering information about our operations." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently turning the ring on her finger. "I see. And you're concerned about this because your railroad connects directly to mine, dear lady. If there's intelligence being gathered about Western expansion plans, it affects both of us." He paused as Martha returned with the coffee service. "Thank you, Martha. That will be all." The housekeeper's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at being dismissed from her own mistress's parlor, but she withdrew without comment. "Furthermore," Hartwell continued, once they were alone again, "there are questions being raised about your loyalty to American interests. Employing Chinese labor is one thing, but bringing them into your home, treating them as something more than workers." He shrugged. "It sends the wrong message." "The wrong message to whom?" "To people who matter, government officials, potential investors, the good citizens of Larkspur Ridge." His voice hardened. "Evelyn, you've built something impressive here, but you're a woman in a man's business. You can't afford to give people reasons to question your judgment." The threat was veiled but unmistakable. Evelyn set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, the fine porcelain making a soft clink against the saucer. For a moment, Li Wei thought she might back down, might offer to sell him back to Hartwell's operation to preserve her own position. Instead, she smiled a cold, dangerous expression that reminded Li Wei why people called her the China Widow. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my reputation, Thomas. But I think you'll find that my judgment has served me quite well over the years." She stood, forcing him to follow suit. "As for my loyalty to American interests, I believe my contributions to westward expansion speak for themselves." Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." But his eyes had narrowed, and Li Wei could see that Evelyn's defiance had not been what he expected. "I simply thought you should be aware of the concerns being expressed." "I appreciate your candor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have business to attend to." Hartwell hesitated, clearly having expected a different outcome from this conversation. "Evelyn, I hope you'll give serious thought to what I've said. It would be unfortunate if these concerns escalated to official channels." "Indeed it would." She moved toward the door, her posture indicating that the meeting was over. "Martha will see you out." After the sound of Hartwell's carriage had faded into the distance, Li Wei remained in the garden, his hands working automatically among the roses while his mind processed what he had heard. The situation was more dangerous than he had realized. Hartwell's suspicions about his identity suggested that someone had been asking questions, making inquiries. If his true background became known, Li Wei. He turned to find Evelyn standing at the garden gate, her dark dress, a stark contrast to the fading autumn flowers. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her posture that suggested she had made a decision. "Yes, Mrs. Van Cleef?" She stepped into the garden, her eyes taking in the work he had done over the past week. The dead branches had been pruned away, the weeds cleared, and already some of the heartier plants were showing signs of new growth. "How much of Mr. Hartwell's visit did you overhear?" The direct question caught him off guard. He could lie, pretend ignorance, but something in her manner suggested that would be a mistake. "Enough to understand that my presence here has created complications for you." "And what do you make of those complications?" Li Wei considered his words carefully. "I think Mr. Hartwell is a man who sees threats where none exist and creates enemies where he might have found allies." "That's a diplomatic answer." She moved closer, stopping beside a rosebush that was just beginning to show new buds. "But I'm more interested in the truth. Are you what he thinks you are?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Li Wei met her gaze steadily, recognizing that this moment would define everything that followed. He could continue the deception, maintain the fiction that he was simply an unfortunate laborer, caught in circumstances beyond his control. It would be safer, certainly. But looking into Evelyn Van Cleef's eyes, he saw something he had not expected, not suspicion or fear, but genuine curiosity. She was not asking because she wanted to expose him, but because she wanted to understand him. "I am not a spy," he said finally, "but I am not what I have appeared to be either." She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. "I thought as much. Your English is too precise, your manner too refined. You carry yourself like a man who once had position. Position is a fragile thing, easily lost, difficult to regain. And what position did you lose?" Li Wei turned back to the roses, his hands gentle among the thorns. "In China, I served as an interpreter for foreign merchants. My family had some small wealth, some influence in our district. When the debts came due," he shrugged, "honor demanded payment, even if it meant selling everything we owned." "Including yourself?" "Including myself." Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, watching him work. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. "Mr. Hartwell seems to think you pose a threat to our operations. Do you agree with him?" She reached out and touched one of the new rosebuds, her fingers careful not to damage the delicate growth. "I think Mr. Hartwell sees threats everywhere because he creates so many of them himself. But I also think," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, "I think you are a man with secrets, Li Wei. And in my experience, men with secrets can be either very dangerous or very valuable. And which do you think I am? Instead of answering directly, she reached into her pocket and withdrew a delicate porcelain teacup, one that Li Wei recognized from the breakfast service. The cup was broken, a clean crack running from the rim to the base. "Clara dropped this yesterday during her lessons," Evelyn said, holding the broken cup carefully. "Martha was going to throw it away, but I asked her to save it. Do you know why?" Li Wei studied the damaged piece, understanding that this was more than a simple question about household management. Because even broken things can sometimes be mended. Exactly. She turned the cup in her hands, the morning light catching the hairline fracture. The crack will always be visible, of course. The cup will never be exactly what it was before. But with the right care, the right attention, it can still serve its purpose. It might even be more beautiful for having been broken and repaired. The metaphor was not lost on him. Li Wei felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the careful guard he had maintained since arriving at the mansion. "And you think I am like this cup?" "I think we all are, in one way or another." She tucked the broken cup back into her pocket. "The question is whether we have the courage to be mended, and whether we can find someone willing to take the time to help us heal." Before he could respond, the sound of Clara's laughter drifted from the house, followed by Martha's gentle voice calling the child to lunch. The ordinary sounds of household life seemed to break the spell of the moment, reminding them both of where they were and what their respective roles demanded. "I should return to the house," Evelyn said, but she made no immediate move to leave. "Li Wei, whatever secrets you carry, whatever position you once held, know that your value to this household does not depend on your past. It depends on who you choose to be while you're here." As she walked back toward the mansion, Li Wei remained among the roses, the broken teacup's image fixed in his mind. For the first time since leaving China, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps his story was not yet finished, that there might be room in this strange new world for a man who had lost everything to find something worth keeping. The Chinese calligraphy set had survived the journey from Guangzhou, wrapped in silk and hidden beneath false boards in Li Wei's traveling chest. Brush, inkstone, rice paper, and a small collection of classical texts, they were all that remained of his former life as a scholar and interpreter. He had kept them secret during his weeks in the labor camps, knowing that education was often seen as dangerous in a man meant to work with his hands. But watching Clara struggle with her lessons in the mansion's library, her small fingers cramped around a steel-nibbed pen as she practiced her letters, Li Wei found himself thinking of gentler ways to teach the beauty of written language. "Uncle Wei," the child had taken to calling him this, despite Martha's gentle corrections about proper forms of address. "Why do you always sit so straight when you read?" Li Wei looked up from the household ledger he had been reviewing for Martha. The housekeeper had discovered his facility with numbers and had gradually begun involving him in tasks beyond basic domestic work. "In my country, we believe that how you hold your body affects how clearly you can think." Clara giggled, trying to mimic his posture. "Like this?" "Very good. But writing is different from reading. Would you like to see?" The child's eyes lit up with curiosity. Li Wei glanced toward the library door, listening for signs of Evelyn's approach. Her morning meetings with railroad supervisors typically lasted until noon, giving him time for this small indulgence. From beneath his vest, he withdrew a piece of rice paper, worn soft from handling. With careful movements, he prepared a small dish of water and withdrew his brush and inkstone from their hiding place behind the books. "This is how my people write," he said, mixing the ink with practiced motions. "Each mark has meaning, but also beauty." Clara watched in fascination as he began to paint the characters for her name, his brush moving with fluid grace across the paper. The Western alphabet gave way to flowing symbols that seemed to dance across the page. "That's my name," she whispered. "Clara," he confirmed. Then below it, painted the characters that meant bright and clear. "And this is what your name means in the language of my ancestors." "It's beautiful. Can you teach me?" Li Wei hesitated. Teaching the child would mean revealing more of himself, taking risks that could expose his educated background. But looking at Clara's eager face, he found it impossible to refuse. "We must be careful," he said quietly. "Some people think that different ways of learning are dangerous. But Aunt Evelyn says learning is the most important thing in the world. Your aunt is a wise woman." "Very well, but this will be our secret lesson, yes?" Over the following days, Li Wei found himself drawn into clandestine teaching sessions with Clara. While Evelyn attended to business and Martha managed the household, he would show the child how to hold the brush, how to breathe while painting characters, how each symbol connected to ideas larger than words. Clara proved to be a gifted student, her natural curiosity making her eager to learn not just the mechanics of brush painting, but the philosophy behind it. Li Wei found himself explaining concepts he had not spoken of in months, the importance of balance, the way emptiness could be as meaningful as fullness, the patience required to master any art worth learning. It was Martha who discovered them, entering the library quietly to dust the shelves and finding Clara bent over a piece of rice paper, her tongue poking out in concentration as she attempted to copy the character for water. The housekeeper stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, the foreign writing materials, the careful attention Li Wei was paying to the child's progress, the obvious affection between teacher and student. "Well," she said after a moment, "this is unexpected." Li Wei rose quickly, prepared to gather his materials and apologize for overstepping his bounds, but Martha raised a hand to stop him. "No need to pack everything away on my account," she said, moving closer to examine Clara's work. "Though I suspect Mrs. Van Cleef might have opinions about secret lessons." "Please don't tell her," Clara pleaded. "Uncle Wei is teaching me beautiful things." Martha studied the child's earnest face, then looked at Li Wei with the shrewdness that had made her indispensable to the Van Cleef household for nearly a decade. "And what exactly is he teaching you?" "How to paint words that look like pictures, and how thinking straight makes your writing better. And how there are many ways to say the same thing depending on how you feel." Clara's explanation tumbled out in a rush of enthusiasm. "I see." Martha picked up one of Li Wei's demonstration pieces, examining the elegant characters with obvious appreciation. "This is quite beautiful. I had no idea you possessed such skills." Li Wei inclined his head slightly. "In my former life, I was fortunate to receive education. I hoped only to share some small knowledge with Miss Clara." "And why the secrecy?" The question hung in the air, highlighting the delicate nature of the situation. Li Wei chose his words carefully. "I thought it best not to presume upon Mrs. Van Cleef's tolerance. I am here to serve the household, not to take liberties with her niece's education." Martha nodded slowly, understanding the implications. A Chinese servant teaching the heir to a railroad fortune could indeed be seen as overstepping bounds, regardless of the educational value. "Clara dear, why don't you go wash your hands before lunch? I need to speak with Li Wei privately." The child reluctantly left her practice papers, extracting a promise from Li Wei that they would continue the lesson later. Once they were alone, Martha settled into the chair across from him, her expression thoughtful. "How long have you been educated?" she asked directly. "Most of my life. My father believed knowledge was the only true wealth. And yet, you ended up on an auction block in a frontier town." Li Wei met her gaze steadily. "Fortune is often cruel to the educated when they have no power to protect themselves." Martha was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Mrs. Van Cleef values learning above almost everything else. She taught herself business and finance when most women weren't even allowed to handle household accounts. But she's also protective of Clara in ways that might surprise you. "I would never do anything to harm the child." "I believe that. The question is whether Mrs. Van Cleef will see it the same way." Martha rose, smoothing her apron. "I won't speak of this to her directly, but I won't lie if she asks me directly either. You should consider telling her yourself before she discovers it on her own." That evening, Li Wei found himself in the garden again, tending to the roses that had become his refuge for thinking. The conversation with Martha had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had grown attached to Clara's eager questions and bright laughter. But more than that, he had begun to feel something he had not experienced since leaving China, the satisfaction of teaching, of passing on knowledge to someone who valued it. The sound of footsteps on the garden path interrupted his thoughts. Evelyn approached through the gathering dusk, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Martha tells me you've been giving Clara additional lessons," she said without preamble. Li Wei straightened, prepared for dismissal or worse. "Yes, ma'am. I apologize if I overstepped." "What are you teaching her?" The question was not what he had expected. He gestured toward the rosebush he had been pruning. Patience, attention to detail, the value of understanding something completely before attempting to change it. Evelyn studied his face in the fading light, through Chinese calligraphy. It was not a question, and Li Wei realized that Martha had indeed spoken to her employer, though perhaps not in the way he had feared. Yes, the brush teaches control, the characters teach meaning, and the practice teaches perseverance. "Show me." Again, she had surprised him. Li Wei retrieved his materials from their hiding place and prepared a small workspace on the garden bench. By lamplight carried from the house, he demonstrated the basic strokes, explaining the philosophy behind each movement. Evelyn watched intently, asking occasional questions that revealed a quick intelligence and genuine curiosity. When he offered to let her try, she accepted the brush with the same careful attention she brought to business negotiations. Her first attempts were clumsy, the characters uneven and uncertain, but she persisted, listening carefully to his guidance about breathing and balance and the importance of intention behind each stroke. "It's more difficult than it appears," she said after several tries. "Most worthwhile things are, but Clara has natural talent for it. And you enjoy teaching her." Li Wei paused in cleaning his brush. "I had forgotten how much I missed it. In China, I taught the children of merchants, helped them understand both their own language and the words of foreign traders. It was fulfilling work." Evelyn set down the brush and studied the characters she had, painted imperfect, but showing improvement even in this short session. "Martha thinks you're more educated than most university graduates she's known." Martha is kind. Martha is observant. She's also concerned about what others might think. If they knew you were teaching Clara skills, they might consider inappropriate for a young lady of her station. Li Wei felt his chest tighten. "I understand. I will discontinue the lessons immediately." "I didn't say you should stop." Evelyn's voice was quiet but firm. "I said Martha was concerned about others' opinions. I care far more about Clara's development than about the narrow-minded opinions of people who fear anything unfamiliar." The relief that washed over Li Wei was almost overwhelming. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. If you're going to continue teaching her, I want to understand exactly what you're teaching and why. Can you do that?" "Of course." Evelyn gathered her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Good. We'll begin tomorrow evening. If Clara is to learn from you, then I will learn as well. I won't have my niece exposed to ideas I don't understand myself." As she walked back toward the house, Li Wei remained in the garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the lingering sense that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with this remarkable woman. For the first time since arriving at the mansion, he allowed himself to hope that perhaps he had found not just shelter, but a place where his true self might be welcome. The portrait of Jonathan Van Cleef had been covered with black silk for 3 years, draped like a shroud over the memory of their brief but passionate marriage. Evelyn had not intended for Li Wei to find her in the parlor at midnight, standing before the unveiled painting with tears streaming down her cheeks. But grief had its own schedule that paid no attention to propriety or servants' sleeping hours. Li Wei appeared in the doorway like a shadow, drawn perhaps by the sound of her weeping or simply by some intuition that she was in distress. He stood silently for a moment, taking in the scene, the covered furniture pushed aside, the portrait revealed in all its painful beauty, and Evelyn herself, usually so composed, undone by memories that refused to stay buried. "I apologize," he said quietly. I heard someone moving about and thought perhaps there was trouble. Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. No trouble. I simply couldn't sleep. Jonathan gazed down at them from the canvas, painted in the flush of their honeymoon years. The artist had captured his warm brown eyes, the gentle smile that had first drawn her to him, the sense of vitality that had made his loss so devastating. He looked so alive in the painting that for a moment she could almost convince herself he might speak. "Your husband?" Li Wei asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes, Jonathan. He died 3 years ago this week." Li Wei stepped into the room, his movements careful and respectful. He was young, 28, the same age I am now. She turned away from the portrait, unable to bear the weight of those painted eyes. Consumption took him in less than 2 months. One day he was laughing at something Clara's father had written in a letter, and the next he was coughing blood into his handkerchief. The raw pain in her voice surprised them both. Evelyn had spoken of Jonathan's death many times to lawyers, to business associates, to well-meaning friends who offered condolences, but always with the composed detachment that her position required. She had never allowed herself to speak of the terrible swiftness of it, the way hope had drained away like water from a broken vessel. Li Wei moved closer, but kept a respectful distance. "In my country, we believe that grief shared is grief halved, but we also understand that some sorrows are too deep to be easily spoken." "How do you bear it?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "The loss of everything you once had?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "Some days I bear it better than others, but I have learned that honoring what we have lost does not mean we must stop living." Easy words. Not easy at all. I think perhaps the most difficult words I have ever had to learn. He gestured toward the portrait. "Your husband, did he bring you joy?" The unexpected question caught her off guard. "Yes, great joy." Then perhaps the question is not how to stop grieving him, but how to live in a way that honors that joy, to find ways to be worthy of the love you shared. Evelyn sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the emotions she had been carrying. "I loved him so much that when he died, I thought love itself was a luxury I could no longer afford. It seemed safer to care only about things that couldn't be taken away: money, power, success. And has that strategy brought you peace?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Peace? No. Safety, perhaps, protection from further loss, but not peace." Li Wei moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where they had shared their lessons in recent evenings. "In my family's garden in Guangzhou, my mother grew a very rare variety of orchid. It bloomed only once every 3 years, and only if conditions were perfect. After it bloomed, the plant would appear to die, flowers would fall, the leaves would wither. My mother would tend it anyway, watering it, keeping it in the proper light, trusting that beneath the apparent death, life continued. And did it bloom again? Every 3 years, like clockwork, more beautiful each time." He turned back to her, his eyes gentle in the lamplight. "Perhaps the heart is like that orchid. Perhaps what seems like death is only dormancy, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again." Evelyn studied his face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of his own losses, his own hard-won wisdom. "You speak as someone who has experienced such dormancy." "I loved someone once. In China. She was the daughter of a silk merchant, beautiful and intelligent and kind. Our families had arranged our marriage, but we were fortunate what began as duty became genuine affection, and affection became love." "What happened to her?" "The debts that brought me here were not only my family's. Her father's business failed, and the shame of it killed him. She took her own life, rather than face poverty and disgrace." His voice remained steady, but Evelyn could hear the old pain beneath the calm surface. "For a long time, I thought I had died with her. It was only when I began to teach again, to find purpose in sharing knowledge, that I realized her love had not been meant to end with her death. It was meant to teach me how to love life itself." The admission hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that transformed the air in the room. Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief she had carried for so long. "I don't know how to love life without him," she whispered. "Perhaps you could begin by loving the life he gave you. The memories, yes, but also the strength you discovered in yourself when you had to carry on alone. The love you show Clara, the kindness you have shown to someone like me who had no claim on your compassion." Evelyn looked up at the portrait again, seeing Jonathan's face with new eyes. He would have liked you. He had a gift for seeing the best in people, for bringing out qualities they didn't know they possessed. Then perhaps some part of him lives on in the woman you have become since his death. The woman who builds schools for railroad workers' children, who ensures her Chinese laborers are paid fairly, who takes in orphaned nieces and gives them love and education. You know about the schools. Li Wei smiled slightly. Martha is very proud of your charitable works. She speaks of them often when she thinks I'm not listening. The thought of Martha boasting about her employer's kindness to the Chinese servant brought an unexpected warmth to Evelyn's chest. Martha sees more good in me than actually exists. I think Martha sees exactly what exists. And I think your husband would be proud of the woman who loved him enough to build something meaningful from the ashes of her grief. Slowly, carefully, Evelyn rose and approached the portrait. She reached up to touch the frame, her fingers tracing the carved wood with gentle reverence. "I've been so afraid that moving forward meant leaving him behind. Moving forward means taking him with you. The love, the lessons, the way he changed one of that disappears when you choose to embrace life again." As if in response to his words, Clara's sleepy voice drifted from the hallway. "Aunt Evelyn, I had another bad dream." Evelyn quickly wiped her eyes and moved toward the door. "Coming, sweetheart." Before she could leave, Li Wei's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Van Cleef, perhaps it is time to leave the portrait uncovered, so that Clara can know her uncle not as a source of sadness, but as part of the love that surrounds her." Evelyn paused in the doorway, looking back at Jonathan's painted face. For the first time in 3 years, the sight of him brought not just pain, but also gratitude for the time they had shared, for the love that had shaped her, for the foundation of happiness that had made her capable of building something worthwhile from her loss. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think you're right." As she went to comfort Clara, Li Wei remained in the parlor for a moment longer, offering a small bow to the portrait of a man he had never met, but who had clearly loved well enough to leave behind someone capable of learning to love again. In the garden the next evening, as they continued Clara's calligraphy lessons under the stars, Evelyn found herself watching Li Wei with new eyes. She saw the way he encouraged Clara's efforts without false praise, how he shared stories from his homeland that opened the child's mind to possibilities beyond Larkspur Ridge, how his presence had brought laughter back to rooms that had been silent too long. "Uncle Wei," Clara asked as she practiced painting the character for Hope, "do you think my papa would have liked learning Chinese writing?" Li Wei glanced at Evelyn, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I think your papa would have loved watching you learn it, and I think he would be very proud of how intelligent and kind you are. Aunt Evelyn says he's still with us, just in a different way. Your aunt is very wise. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow." As Clara bent over her practice paper with renewed concentration, Evelyn felt Jonathan's presence not as a weight holding her to the past, but as a gentle blessing on whatever future she might choose to build. For the first time in 3 years, that future seemed to include room for hope, for growth, and perhaps even for the kind of love that honored rather than betrayed the memory of what she had lost. The railroad survey map spread across Thomas Hartwell's desk like a promise of conquest, its carefully drawn lines marking the proposed route through Chinese settlements that had existed long before any white man set foot in Larkspur Ridge. Red ink marked the planned stations, blue indicated water sources, and black X's showed where existing structures would need to be demolished to make way for progress. Li Wei studied the map from his position by the window, using his role as server during Evelyn's unexpected business meeting to gather intelligence that could save lives. Hartwell had arrived that morning with a delegation of railroad investors, ostensibly to discuss a proposed partnership between their companies. But the true purpose became clear as soon as the map was unrolled. The Chinese settlement sits directly in our planned path. Hartwell was explaining to the assembled men, his finger tracing the route that would slice through the heart of the community, where many of Li Wei's former fellow workers had built modest homes. The good news is that they have no legal claim to the land. We can clear them out with minimal resistance. "What about compensation?" asked one of the investors, a thin man with nervous hands who kept adjusting his spectacles. Hartwell laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "Compensation? These people are squatters at best, criminal elements at worst. Any money we give them would be pure charity, and I'm not in the charity business." Evelyn sat at the head of her own conference table, her expression carefully neutral as she listened to the proposal. Li Wei could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers pressed against the polished wood, as if anchoring herself against the current of the conversation. "The route does offer certain efficiencies," admitted Samuel Morrison, Evelyn's chief engineer. "The grade is favorable, and we'd save months of construction time by avoiding the mountain passes to the north." "Exactly." Hartwell leaned forward, sensing advantage. "Evelyn, your section connects directly to this proposed route. Joint development would increase profits for both our companies by at least 30%. Evelyn's eyes found Li Wei's across the room, a brief glance that somehow conveyed volumes. "And what of the workers currently employed in that area?" "Many of them have been with my operation for 2 years or more." "Workers are replaceable," Hartwell said dismissively. "We'll bring in Irish crews for the actual construction, more reliable, better suited to the work." "I see." Evelyn rose from her chair, moving to examine the map more closely. Li Wei watched her trace the proposed route with one finger, her touch lingering over the areas marked for demolition. "And this timeline assumes no resistance from the current residents." "What resistance could they offer? They're not organized, they have no legal standing, and frankly, most of them would probably welcome the opportunity to move on to other employment." Li Wei felt his jaw tighten at the casual dismissal of lives and homes, but he maintained his composure. Through the window, he could see the settlement in question, a collection of modest but well-maintained buildings, where families had created a small community, complete with a school, a temple, and gardens that reminded him painfully of home. "Thomas," Evelyn said carefully, "I appreciate the potential profitability of this venture, but I'm concerned about the human cost. These people have invested their labor and savings in building something meaningful." Hartwell's expression darkened. "Evelyn, I hoped we could discuss this as equals, as business partners who understand the realities of progress. But if you're going to be sentimental about a handful of Chinamen, I'm being practical about the workforce that has made my railroad profitable," she interrupted, her voice carrying a steel edge that made the room fall silent. "And I'm being cautious about ventures that could expose us to legal challenges or labor disputes." The nervous investor spoke up again. "What sort of legal challenges?" Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Well, there have been some questions raised about the original land grants in that area. Nothing definitive, but if the Chinese community were to organize, hire lawyers." "They don't have money for lawyers," Hartwell snapped. "They do, if someone provides it for them," Evelyn said quietly. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Hartwell's face flushed red as he processed what she was suggesting. "You would finance legal opposition to a joint venture that would benefit both our companies." "I would fulfill my obligations to workers who have served me faithfully, and I would protect my own interests from ventures that might prove more costly than profitable." Li Wei felt a surge of something that might have been hope, followed immediately by fear for what Evelyn's stance might cost her. He had learned enough about railroad politics to know that Hartwell was not a man who accepted opposition gracefully. "Gentlemen," Hartwell said, his voice tightly controlled, "perhaps you could give Mrs. Van Cleef and me a few moments to discuss this privately." The investors and Morrison filed out, leaving Evelyn alone with Hartwell and, technically, Li Wei, though his presence seemed to have been forgotten in the tension of the moment. "Evelyn," Hartwell began, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as paternal. "I understand that managing Chinese labor has given you certain attachments to these people, but you're allowing sentiment to cloud your business judgment." "My business judgment has served me quite well, Thomas. Better than yours, judging by the reports I've heard about your recent losses in the copper speculation." Hartwell's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You've been investigating my affairs?" "I investigate all potential partners. It's good business practice." She moved back to her chair but remained standing. "What I found suggests that you need this joint venture more than I do. And what I know suggests that you're in no position to be choosy about partnerships." His voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "There are people asking questions about your loyalty, Evelyn, about your unusual employment practices, your coddling of foreign workers, your apparent sympathy for enemies of American progress." Li Wei tensed, recognizing the threat for what it was. He began to move closer to the table, ready to intervene if necessary, but Evelyn's slight gesture warned him to remain still. "Are you threatening me, Thomas?" "I'm offering friendly advice. The political climate is changing. Anti-Chinese sentiment is growing stronger every month, and people who are seen as too sympathetic to foreign interests might find themselves facing uncomfortable scrutiny." "I see. And you're concerned about my welfare." "I'm concerned about stability in our industry. A scandal involving one of the territory's most prominent railroad families would be bad for everyone's business." Evelyn smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "How thoughtful. And I suppose supporting your venture through the Chinese settlement would demonstrate my patriotic commitment to American progress. It would certainly help dispel any unfortunate rumors." For a long moment, the room was silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of workers calling to each other in the rail yards below. Li Wei found himself holding his breath, waiting for Evelyn's response to what was clearly both a bribe and a threat. "Thomas," she said finally, "I think this meeting is over. I hope you'll reconsider." "I've considered, and my answer is no. I will not participate in a venture that requires the destruction of an established community, and I will not be intimidated by vague threats about my patriotism." She moved to the door, opening it with deliberate finality. "Good day, gentlemen." After Hartwell and his associates had departed in obvious anger, Evelyn remained standing by the window, her shoulders rigid with tension. Li Wei approached carefully, setting down the coffee service he had been pretending to manage. "You realize what you've just done?" he asked quietly. "I've declined a business proposition that would have made me wealthy at the cost of destroying people's lives. You've also made an enemy of a very dangerous man." She turned to face him, and he was struck by the mixture of determination and uncertainty in her eyes. "Perhaps. But I've also discovered something about myself that I had thought lost." "What's that?" "That there are still some things I value more than money." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Li Wei, that settlement Hartwell wants to destroy, how many families live there?" 43 families, perhaps 200 people in total, including children. "Do they have anywhere else to go?" Li Wei shook his head. "Most have spent everything they had to build what they have there. They came from China with nothing, worked for years to save enough to bring their families over, built homes with their own hands. That settlement represents their entire world." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "And if Hartwell proceeds without my cooperation? He'll find other investors, other routes of legal justification. The result will be the same. The community will be destroyed, the families scattered." Li Wei paused, then added quietly, "Unless someone with influence decides to protect them. Someone like me. Someone exactly like you." She nodded slowly, as if confirming a decision she had already made. "Then we need to discuss how to make that protection effective. Can you arrange a meeting with the community leaders?" Li Wei felt something expand in his chest: gratitude, admiration, and something deeper that he was not yet ready to name. "Yes. But Mrs. Van Cleef, You must understand the risk you're taking." Hartwell was not making idle threats. "I understand, but I also understand that some risks are worth taking." She moved back to the conference table, rolling up the survey map with brisk efficiency. "Besides, I have advantages that Hartwell doesn't know about." "Such as?" She smiled, and for the first time since the meeting began, the expression held genuine warmth. "I have someone who understands both communities and can help me build bridges between them. Someone who has already shown me that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources." As she spoke, Clara appeared in the doorway, her school dress rumpled from playing in the garden. "Aunt Evelyn? Uncle Wei? Martha says there were important men here, and they looked angry when they left." Evelyn opened her arms, and the child ran to her for a hug. "Just business discussions, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." "Good. Uncle Wei promised to show me how to paint the character for Brave today." Clara looked up at Li Wei with trusting eyes. "He says brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared." Li Wei met Evelyn's gaze over the child's head, seeing his own thoughts reflected there. Perhaps Clara's innocent wisdom had captured exactly what they were all learning. That true courage lay not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to act rightly despite it. "That's exactly right," Evelyn said, her voice soft with affection. "Uncle Wei is a very wise teacher." As they moved toward the garden for the afternoon's lesson, Li Wei felt the weight of the survey map in his memory, its red lines and black X's representing the destruction that Hartwell planned to bring. But he also felt the strength of Evelyn's resolve, the power of her growing commitment to something larger than profit. For the first time since arriving in America, he began to believe that perhaps some battles could be won, that some communities could be saved, and that the bond growing between him and this remarkable woman might be strong enough to build something beautiful from the ashes of what others would destroy. The jade pendant had belonged to Li Wei's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had worn it for protection and good fortune. It was carved in the shape of a butterfly, its wings spread as if caught in eternal flight, and the stone held the deep green color of spring leaves after rain. When he placed it around Clara's neck after her latest nightmare, the child's fingers immediately went to touch its smooth surface. "It's beautiful, Uncle Wei," she whispered, still trembling from dreams of her parents' death. "But I can't take something so precious." Li Wei adjusted the pendant so it lay properly against her small chest, his movements gentle and deliberate. "My grandmother told me that precious things are meant to be shared with precious people. She said the jade would protect the person who needed it most. But what if I lose it? Then it was meant to find its way to someone else who needed protection. That's how love works. Little one, it grows stronger when we give it away." Evelyn watched from the doorway, having been drawn by Clara's cries, and staying to witness this moment of tenderness between the man she had purchased and the child she cherished. The sight of Li Wei's family heirloom resting against Clara's nightgown struck her as profoundly symbolic, a bridge between worlds, a gesture of belonging that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and station. "Feel better now?" Li Wei asked, settling into the chair beside Clara's bed. The child nodded, her breathing finally steady. "Uncle Wei, when I grow up, will I be brave like Aunt Evelyn?" "You're already brave, Clara. Every day you choose to hope instead of staying afraid, you show more courage than most adults ever manage." "But Aunt Evelyn fights bad men and protects people. Yesterday I heard Martha telling Cook that she made Mr. Hartwell very angry by refusing to hurt the Chinese families." Li Wei glanced toward Evelyn, noting the way her expression tightened at the mention of her confrontation with Hartwell. The consequences of that meeting were still unfolding, and not all of them were pleasant. "Your aunt is indeed brave," he said carefully, "but there are many ways to be courageous. Sometimes the bravest thing is simply being kind when others are cruel." Clara touched the jade pendant again, drawing comfort from its smooth warmth. "Will you tell me a story about your grandmother, about when she was brave?" As Li Wei began weaving a tale of his grandmother's escape from bandits during her youth, Evelyn found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. 3 weeks had passed since the railroad meeting, and the aftermath had been exactly as troublesome as Li Wei had predicted. Hartwell's influence in territorial politics was considerable, and whispers about her loyalty had begun circulating among potential investors and government officials. But other changes had occurred as well, changes that she was only beginning to understand. The Chinese settlement had welcomed her offer of legal protection with gratitude that humbled her. Li Wei had arranged meetings with community leaders, serving as translator and cultural guide as she learned about lives that had been invisible to her despite their proximity to her own operations. The experience had opened her eyes to a world of quiet dignity, strong family bonds, and profound resilience in the face of hardship. She had met children who spoke 3 languages by age 10, craftsmen whose skills rivaled anything she had seen in San Francisco, scholars who discussed philosophy with the same passion her business associates brought to profit margins. Most surprising of all, she had begun to see herself reflected in their eyes, not as the feared China widow, but as someone who might genuinely care about their welfare. "Aunt Evelyn?" Clara's sleepy voice interrupted her thoughts. "Are you going to marry Uncle Wei?" The question struck the room like lightning, leaving both adults momentarily speechless. Li Wei's story trailed off mid-sentence, and Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite the autumn chill. "Clara," she said gently, "what makes you ask such a thing? You look at him the way Papa looked at Mama in the photographs, and he looks at you the way the prince looks at the princess in my storybooks. And you're both sad when you think the other one isn't watching." The child's innocent observation contained more truth than Evelyn was prepared to acknowledge, even to herself. Over the past weeks, she had indeed found herself watching Li Wei with growing fascination, admiring the patience he showed with Clara, the wisdom he brought to problems that had seemed insurmountable, the quiet strength that seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker in the face of adversity. "Marriage is more complicated than storybooks suggest, sweetheart," Evelyn said carefully. "People of different backgrounds face challenges that. But you love each other, don't you?" The directness of the question left both adults struggling for words. Li Wei looked down at his hands, while Evelyn found herself unable to form a response that would be both honest and appropriate. "Love is," Li Wei began, then stopped, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Love is a gift that sometimes comes to people when they least expect it. But whether those people can act on that love depends on many things beyond their control." "That's a grown-up way of saying yes," Clara said with the satisfied air of someone who had solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "I hope you do marry him, Aunt Evelyn. He makes you smile the way you used to smile in the pictures with Uncle Jonathan." The mention of her dead husband might have been painful, but instead Evelyn found herself thinking of Jonathan's generous spirit, his belief that love should triumph over convention. He would have approved of Li Wei, she realized. He would have seen past surface differences to the essential goodness beneath. "I think," she said quietly, "that it's time for a certain young lady to get some sleep. We can discuss complicated questions in the morning." After Clara had drifted off, clutching the jade pendant like a talisman, Evelyn and Li Wei found themselves walking together through the moonlit garden. The roses he had nursed back to health were showing their final blooms of the season, their petals ghostly pale in the silver light. "She sees too much," Evelyn said finally. "Children often see what adults work very hard not to notice." They paused beside the fountain, its gentle splash the only sound besides their own breathing. The air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities, with questions that neither dared voice directly. "Li Wei," Evelyn began, then stopped, uncertain how to proceed. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either bear their weight or collapse beneath them. Evelyn felt her heart racing, as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine whether she stepped back to safety or leaped into unknown territory. "The scandal would destroy everything I've built," she whispered. "Yes. People would say I had lost my mind, that grief had driven me to madness. Yes. My business associates would abandon me, my social standing would evaporate, Clara's future would be compromised. All of that is true. She turned to face him fully, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his dark eyes. And yet some things matter more than scandal, or social standing, or even business success. Do they? Li Wei reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. Your husband's portrait watches over the parlor now, uncovered and honored. Clara wears a piece of my family's history around her neck and calls me uncle with pride. You have risked your reputation to protect people you barely knew, simply because it was right. Are these not the actions of someone who already understands what matters most? Evelyn felt tears gathering in her eyes knot. Tears of grief this time, but tears of possibility, of hope she had thought lost forever. I'm afraid. So am I. But I am more afraid of living the rest of my life, wondering what might have been if we had been brave enough to choose love over fear. The word hung between them, love, spoken aloud for the first time, making real what they had both felt, but neither had dared name. Evelyn felt something break open inside her chest, a dam that had held back 3 years of careful emotional control. I don't know how this can work, she said through her tears. Neither do I, but perhaps we can discover it together. When he leaned forward to kiss her, she met him halfway, their lips touching with the tentative wonder of two people who had found something precious in the ruins of their separate losses. The kiss tasted of moonlight and possibility, of jasmine from the garden and the salt of grateful tears. When they separated, Li Wei touched his forehead to hers, his breath warm against her skin. Clara is right, you know. You do make me think of princes and princesses in fairy tales, even if this particular fairy tale might not have a conventional happy ending. Especially then, the best stories are about people who choose love despite the obstacles, not because love is easy. As they walked back toward the house, hand in hand under the stars, Evelyn found herself thinking not of the difficulties that lay ahead, but of the surprising strength she felt in Li Wei's presence. For 3 years, she had believed that loving someone meant making yourself vulnerable to devastating loss. But perhaps Li Wei was right. Perhaps love was not a weakness to be protected against, but a source of strength that grew more powerful when shared. Behind Clara's bedroom window, the jade pendant caught a beam of moonlight and seemed to glow with ancient approval, as if Li Wei's grandmother were offering her blessing on this unlikely union between two souls who had found their way to each other across oceans and cultures and the vast distances of human loneliness. The forged deed lay spread across Sheriff Morrison's desk like evidence of treason, its official-looking seals and signatures damning Evelyn Van Cleef as surely as if she had confessed to the charges herself. Thomas Hartwell stood beside the desk, with the satisfied air of a man who had played a long game and finally achieved checkmate. As you can see, Sheriff, Hartwell was saying, his voice heavy with false regret, Mrs. Van Cleef has been selling railroad route information to Chinese imperial agents. This deed transfers mineral rights in the disputed territory to a consortium based in San Francisco, consortium with documented ties to foreign interests. Sheriff Morrison, a weathered man in his 50s who had known Evelyn since her marriage to Jonathan, studied the documents with obvious reluctance. Thomas, these are serious accusations. Mrs. Van Cleef has been a pillar of this community for years, which makes her betrayal all the more shocking. Hartwell produced another set of papers from his leather satchel. We also have testimony from reliable witnesses who observed her meeting with known Chinese agents, including private conversations conducted entirely in Chinese. Li Wei felt his blood turn to ice as he recognized what was happening. From his position in the hallway outside the sheriff's office, where he had come to deliver a message for Evelyn, he could see the careful orchestration of Hartwell's trap. The man had been planning this for weeks, gathering false evidence and coaching witnesses to create a web of lies that would destroy Evelyn's reputation and business empire. The meetings were conducted through her Chinese servant. Hartwell continued, the same man she purchased at auction under suspicious circumstances. We believe he's been acting as her translator and go-between with foreign agents. Sheriff Morrison looked up from the papers. You're talking about Li Wei? Thomas, that man's been nothing but respectful and hard-working since he arrived. I find it hard to believe. Sheriff, with respect, you're not familiar with the sophisticated methods these people use. Li Wei presents himself as a simple laborer, but our investigation has revealed that he was actually a high-ranking interpreter in the Chinese Imperial Service before his arrival in America. The words hit Li Wei like physical blows. Somehow, Hartwell had uncovered his true background, the carefully hidden identity that could now be used to destroy both him and the woman he loved. He thought of the jade pendant around Clara's neck, of Evelyn's trust, of the Chinese families counting on her protection, and felt the weight of his past crushing down on him like an avalanche. Furthermore, Hartwell was saying, we have evidence that Miss Van Cleef has been using her relationship with this man to pass sensitive information about American railroad expansion to hostile foreign powers. The recent protection she offered to the Chinese settlement was clearly intended to facilitate espionage activities. Sheriff Morrison set down the papers with obvious distaste. These are federal crimes you're alleging, Thomas. Treason, conspiracy with foreign agents, the penalties would be severe. Which is why I hope to handle this matter quietly, for the good of the community. But Mrs. Van Cleef's continued defiance of reasonable requests for cooperation has forced my hand. Li Wei understood now that every move in this chess game had been calculated from the beginning. Hartwell's original proposition about the railroad route had been designed to fail, creating justification for more aggressive action. The labor auction where Evelyn had purchased him had likely been arranged specifically to place him in her household, providing the connection Hartwell needed to fabricate his charges of espionage. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Evelyn's arrival, and Li Wei quickly withdrew deeper into the shadows of the hallway. Through the open door, he watched as she entered the sheriff's office with the composed dignity that had made her legendary in Larkspur Ridge. "Sheriff Morrison," she said pleasantly, "I received your message requesting my immediate presence. I hope there's no emergency." "I'm afraid there is, Mrs. Van Cleef." Morrison gestured toward the papers on his desk. "Some very serious charges have been brought against you." Evelyn's gaze moved to Hartwell, and Li Wei saw the moment when she understood the true nature of the trap that had been laid for her. Her expression remained calm, but her posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. "What sort of charges?" "Treason, conspiracy with foreign agents, selling state secrets to hostile powers." Morrison's voice carried genuine regret. "Evelyn, I've known you for years, and these accusations seem impossible to believe. But the evidence. May I see this evidence?" As Evelyn examined the forged documents, Li Wei saw her face grow pale. The papers were convincing official letterheads, proper seals, signatures that looked genuine, even to someone familiar with legal documents. Hartwell had invested considerable time and money in creating evidence that would stand up to initial scrutiny. "This deed," she said finally, "purports to show me transferring mineral rights to a Chinese consortium." "Correct," Hartwell said smoothly. "Rights that contain strategic information about planned railroad routes through territories of military significance." "And these other papers?" "Communications between you and your Chinese agent discussing payment for information and ongoing intelligence gathering." Evelyn set down the papers carefully. "Sheriff, I assume you're familiar with my handwriting from various legal documents I've filed over the years." "Of course." "Then you'll notice that while the signature on these papers resembles mine, the handwriting in the body of the letters does not match my usual style." Morrison picked up one of the letters, examining it more closely. "Well, the signature does look like yours." "Signatures can be forged, Sheriff, particularly if someone has access to enough samples of the genuine article." Evelyn's voice carried a steely edge. "Mr. Hartwell, where exactly did you obtain these documents?" "Through confidential sources within the federal investigation. I'm not at liberty to reveal." "Of course you're not." She turned back to Morrison. "Sheriff, these charges are fabricated. The documents are forgeries, and the witnesses Mr. Hartwell claims to have are either lying or don't exist." That's a serious accusation against a respected businessman, Morrison said uncomfortably. And treason is a serious accusation against a respected member of this community. One of us is lying, Sheriff. I suggest you investigate thoroughly before proceeding with any arrests. Hartwell stepped forward, his mask of regret slipping slightly. Sheriff, while I appreciate Mrs. Van Cleef's protestations of innocence, we can't allow sentiment to override the security of the territory. The evidence is clear, and the threat to American interests is immediate. What threat exactly? Evelyn asked coldly. The Chinese imperial government is planning military expansion into American territories. The information you've provided has facilitated their intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Li Wei felt his heart racing as he realized the full scope of Hartwell's plan. The man wasn't just trying to destroy Evelyn's business or force her cooperation. He was attempting to create justification for broader anti-Chinese actions that would benefit his own expansion plans while eliminating any opposition. And you have proof of this Chinese military threat? Evelyn pressed. The proof is in the documents before you. No, Mr. Hartwell. The documents purport to show my cooperation with Chinese agents. I'm asking for proof that such agents exist and that they represent a genuine threat to American security. Morrison looked between them, clearly out of his depth in matters of international espionage and territorial security. Mrs. Van Cleef, while I have doubts about these charges, I'm going to have to ask you to remain in town while we sort this out, and I'll need to question your Chinese employee as well. Of course, Sheriff. Li Wei has nothing to hide. But even as she spoke, Li Wei knew that his presence would only strengthen Hartwell's case. The man had done his homework. He knew about Li Wei's background as an imperial interpreter, about his education and connections to the Chinese diplomatic service. In the current climate of anti-Chinese sentiment, those facts would be twisted into evidence of espionage, regardless of the truth. He also knew something that neither Evelyn nor Sheriff Morrison understood, yet Hartwell's plan extended beyond these immediate charges. The man had been systematically gathering information about Evelyn's business operations, her personal relationships, and her financial dealings. This accusation of treason was simply the opening move in a campaign designed to destroy everything she had built. As the meeting in the sheriff's office continued, Li Wei quietly withdrew from the building and made his way through the back streets of Larkspur Ridge toward the Chinese settlement. If he was going to save Evelyn, he would need help from the only people who understood the true stakes of Hartwell's conspiracy, and he would need to reveal secrets about his own past that he had hoped never to share. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as he approached the settlement, carrying with him the weight of decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of the woman he loved and the community that had begun to trust in her protection. For the first time since arriving in America, Li Wei faced a choice that would require him to embrace his true identity rather than hide from it. The game Hartwell had set in motion could only be won by someone who understood the rules of power and diplomacy at the highest levels. Li Wei had spent years avoiding that world, but now he would have to return to it not as a servant or laborer, but as Li Wei, former attaché to the imperial court, educated in both Eastern and Western law, and the only person in Larkspur Ridge who might have the knowledge and connections necessary to expose Hartwell's lies before they destroyed everything that mattered. As he prepared to reveal the truth about himself, he thought of Clara wearing his grandmother's jade pendant, of Evelyn's courage in defending the Chinese families, of the garden they had tended together under the stars. Some things were worth any risk, worth any sacrifice. The time for hiding was over. The telegraph key clicked with urgent precision as Li Wei composed the most important message of his life, his fingers finding the familiar rhythm despite the years that had passed since he last used his diplomatic credentials. In the back room of the Chinese settlement's general store, surrounded by the worried faces of community leaders, he carefully coded a communication that would either save them all or seal their destruction. To His Excellency Chen Weiming, First Secretary, Chinese Consulate, San Francisco, he tapped out in the international code. Request immediate verification of credentials and legal assistance. Imperial interpreter Li Wei, formerly of Guangzhou diplomatic mission, requires urgent consultation regarding fabricated espionage charges against American business partner. Matter involves forged documents and false conspiracy allegations designed to facilitate seizure of Chinese community property. Elder Zhang, the settlement's unofficial leader, watched with amazement as Li Wei operated the telegraph equipment with the skill of someone who had once communicated regularly with officials across 2 continents. The revelation of Li Wei's true identity had stunned the community, but it had also given them something they had never possessed before: hope that someone with real power might be willing to help them. "You are certain this Chen Weiming will remember you?" Zhang asked in Mandarin. "We served together for 3 years. He will remember." Li Wei paused in his transmission. "The question is whether he will be willing to risk his position to help us. The political situation between our countries is delicate, and if he refuses..." Li Wei resumed his careful tapping. "Then we proceed with our alternative plan and hope that truth is stronger than fabricated evidence." While Li Wei worked to contact his former colleagues, Evelyn was fighting her own battle in the mansion that had once been her sanctuary. Martha had spent the morning gathering household documents, correspondence, and financial records that might help prove her employer's innocence, while Clara clung to her aunt's skirts with the instinctive fear of a child who sensed that her world was once again threatened by forces beyond her control. "Mrs. Van Cleef," Martha said, entering the library with another box of papers, "I've found your correspondence with the territorial governor regarding the Chinese workers' rights legislation. It clearly shows your positions have been consistent for years, the actions of someone secretly working against American interests." Evelyn barely looked up from the legal briefs she was reviewing. Since Jonathan's death, she had made it a practice to understand every aspect of law that might affect her business, but nothing had prepared her for defending against charges of treason. "Good. Add it to the pile. What about the bank records?" "All in order. They show regular business transactions, charitable donations to the territorial schools, and the establishment of the Workers' Compensation Fund. Nothing that suggests secret payments to foreign agents, unless Hartwell has found a way to fabricate those as well." Evelyn rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of exhaustion and worry. "Martha, has there been any word from Li Wei?" "None since he left for the settlement this morning, but Mrs. Van Cleef..." Martha hesitated, then continued with the directness that had always characterized their relationship. "Are you certain we can trust him? I mean, if he truly was an imperial interpreter, if his background is so different from what we believed." The question hung in the air between them, giving voice to the doubt that Evelyn had been fighting since learning the truth about Li Wei's past. Part of her understood Martha's concern. If Li Wei had deceived them about his identity, what else might he have hidden? But a larger part of her, the part that had watched him tend Clara's nightmares and nurture dying roses back to life, refused to believe that his kindness had been an elaborate deception. "I trust him," she said quietly. "Whatever his reasons for hiding his past, his actions since arriving here have been those of an honorable man. Even though he's put you in danger by his very presence." "He didn't create this danger, Martha. Hartwell would have found some way to attack me regardless. Li Wei's background simply gave him a convenient weapon to use." Evelyn stood and moved to the window, gazing toward the Chinese settlement in the distance. "If anything, Li Wei's knowledge of diplomatic protocol might be the only thing that can save us." Clara appeared in the doorway, her face pale and worried. "Aunt Evelyn, there are men coming up the drive. They don't look friendly." Through the window, Evelyn could see a group of riders approaching the mansion territorial officials by their bearing, accompanied by what appeared to be federal marshals. Hartwell's influence had clearly reached beyond the local level. "Martha, take Clara to her room and stay with her," Evelyn instructed, her voice calm despite the racing of her heart. "Whatever happens, don't let her see anything that might frighten her further. What about you? I'll meet with these gentlemen and hear what they have to say." Evelyn straightened her shoulders, drawing on the composure that had carried her through 3 years of widowhood and business challenges. "If they've come to arrest me, I won't give them the satisfaction of seeing me cower." As Martha led Clara away, Evelyn positioned herself in the front parlor, where Jonathan's portrait could watch over whatever confrontation was about to unfold. She had just enough time to compose herself before the knock came at the door. The federal marshal who entered was a thin, serious man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the room. Behind him came two territorial officials and, to Evelyn's dismay, Thomas Hartwell himself. "Mrs. Van Cleef," the marshal said, removing his hat with perfunctory politeness. "I'm Marshal Davidson. I believe you've been informed of the charges against you." Sheriff Morrison mentioned some allegations, yes. Though I must say the speed with which federal authorities have become involved is remarkable. Hartwell stepped forward, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Mrs. Van Cleef, I take no pleasure in these proceedings, but matters of territorial security cannot be ignored." "How thoughtful of you to be so concerned about security, Mr. Hartwell. I'm curious, when did you first suspect me of treasonous activities?" The question was meant to probe for weaknesses in his story, and Evelyn was gratified to see a flicker of uncertainty cross his features. "The evidence has been accumulating for some time. Your unusual employment practices, your secretive meetings with Chinese nationals, your opposition to legitimate business development." "My opposition to your business development, you mean?" Marshal Davidson raised a hand to stop the verbal sparring. "Mrs. Van Cleef, we're here to conduct a search of your premises and to question you and your employees about these allegations. I hope you'll cooperate fully." "Of course, Marshal. Though I should point out that searching a private residence on the basis of forged documents might raise certain constitutional questions. The documents have been verified by experts." "Experts employed by whom?" When Davidson didn't answer immediately, Evelyn pressed her advantage. "Marshal, I'm sure you're aware that Mr. Hartwell has significant financial interests that would benefit from my disgrace. Has anyone considered that he might have fabricated this evidence to eliminate a business rival?" "That's a serious accusation," one of the territorial officials said. "Less serious than treason, but serious nonetheless." Evelyn moved to her desk, retrieving a folder she had prepared. "Gentlemen, before you proceed with your search, I'd like you to examine some documents of my own. Bank records showing my charitable contributions to territorial schools, correspondence with government officials regarding fair labor practices, and testimony from Chinese community leaders about my efforts to protect their legal rights." As the officials reluctantly examined her evidence, the sound of multiple horses approaching at high speed drew everyone's attention. Through the window, Evelyn could see Li Wei riding hard toward the mansion, accompanied by two men in the formal dress of Chinese diplomatic officials. Hartwell's face went pale as he recognized the implications of their arrival. "What is the meaning of this?" Li Wei dismounted with fluid grace and approached the mansion with the bearing of a man who was no longer pretending to be anything other than what he was. The two Chinese officials flanked him, their presence lending weight to whatever revelations were about to unfold. "Mrs. Van Cleef," Li Wei said as he entered the parlor, his English now carrying the precise diction of someone educated in diplomatic protocol. "I apologize for my absence. I was arranging for proper representation in this matter." "Representation?" Marshal Davidson asked. "Allow me to introduce Chen Weiming, First Secretary of the Chinese Consulate in San Francisco, and Liu Jinlong, Legal Attaché, specializing in international disputes." Li Wei's voice carried new authority as he gestured to his companions. "Gentlemen, this is Mrs. Evelyn Van Cleef, whom I have the honor to represent in these proceedings." Chen Weiming stepped forward, presenting official credentials with formal precision. "Marshal Davidson, I understand there have been allegations of espionage involving Chinese nationals. The Chinese government takes such matters very seriously and wishes to ensure that justice is served. Furthermore," added Liu Jinlong, producing a leather portfolio, "we have reviewed the documents that form the basis of these charges and have identified several significant irregularities that call their authenticity into question." Hartwell's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. "Who are these people? What authority do they have here? The same authority that allowed you to fabricate evidence of Chinese espionage. Li Wei replied coolly. Mr. Hartwell, I believe you know more about these forged documents than you've admitted. I don't know what you're talking about. Chen Weiming opened his portfolio and withdrew a set of official papers. Mr. Hartwell, are you familiar with the authentic letterhead and seal of the Chinese Imperial Diplomatic Service? No, of course not. Then how did you know to forge them so accurately in your fabricated evidence? Liu Jinlong produced copies of the documents Hartwell had presented to Sheriff Morrison. These papers purport to show communications between Mrs. Van Cleef and Chinese agents, but they contain diplomatic seals that are not available to the general public. Someone with access to authentic Chinese government documents created these forgeries. Marshal Davidson studied the papers with growing concern. Are you saying that these documents are definitely forgeries? Absolutely. Furthermore, the Chinese officials named in these communications do not exist. The positions referenced are fictitious, and the policy matters discussed bear no resemblance to actual Chinese government positions. Evelyn felt a surge of hope mixed with admiration for Li Wei's careful preparation. Marshal, it would seem that the only person with access to both authentic Chinese diplomatic materials and detailed knowledge of my business operations would be someone who had planned this frame from the beginning. All eyes turned to Hartwell, whose face had gone from pale to flushed red. This is ridiculous. You're taking the word of foreign nationals over that of an American businessman. We're taking the word of diplomatic officials whose credentials can be verified. Marshal Davidson said grimly, Mr. Hartwell, I think you need to explain how you came into possession of these documents and why you were so certain of their authenticity. I received them from federal sources. What federal sources? Chen Weiming interrupted. Because according to our communications with Washington, no federal investigation into Mrs. Van Cleef exists. No Chinese espionage activity has been reported in this territory, and no American officials have requested Chinese government cooperation in investigating such matters. The web of lies was unraveling with devastating speed. Li Wei stepped closer to Hartwell, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years navigating the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. Mr. Hartwell, you made one critical error in your fabrication. You assumed that a Chinese servant in an American household would have no connections to his homeland, no way to verify or disprove your allegations. You didn't know that I served for 5 years as an interpreter and cultural liaison in the Imperial Diplomatic Service, or that I maintained contact with officials who can expose your lies. This is all very convenient, Hartwell said desperately. A Chinese spy reveals himself just in time to save his American accomplice? Not a spy, Mr. Hartwell, a diplomat. There's a significant difference, as you're about to discover. Li Wei turned to the marshal. Sir, I formally request that you arrest Thomas Hartwell for conspiracy, forgery of government documents, and filing false charges against an American citizen. Chen Weiming nodded gravely. The Chinese government supports these charges and offers full cooperation in prosecuting this matter. Mr. Hartwell's actions constitute not only crimes against Mrs. Van Cleef, but also an attack on Chinese-American diplomatic relations. As the marshals moved to arrest Hartwell, his composure finally shattered completely. You don't understand. She's dangerous. She's protecting them, helping them organize against American interests. She's protecting American citizens of Chinese descent from illegal seizure of their property, Liu Jinlong corrected, which I believe is what American law requires of all citizens. As Hartwell was led away in chains, still protesting his innocence and the righteousness of his cause, Evelyn found herself looking at Li Wei with new eyes. The man she had purchased at auction, the servant she had come to love, had revealed himself to be someone with the power to move governments and command the respect of international officials. Li Wei, she said quietly, or should I call you by your diplomatic title? Li Wei is fine, he replied, some of the formality leaving his voice. The titles belong to my past. What matters now is our future. Chen Weiming cleared his throat diplomatically. Mr. Li Wei, the Consul General, has asked me to convey his regards and to inform you that your position remains available should you choose to return to diplomatic service. Li Wei looked at Evelyn, then at Clara, who had appeared in the doorway despite Martha's efforts to keep her safely upstairs. The child ran to him with the absolute trust of someone who had never doubted his essential goodness, despite the revelations about his identity. "Thank you, First Secretary Chen," Li Wei said formally. "But I have found a different kind of service here, one that suits me better than diplomatic protocol." As the Chinese officials took their leave and the marshals departed with their prisoner, the mansion fell into a strange quiet. The immediate crisis had passed, but Evelyn knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. Li Wei had saved her, saved the Chinese settlement, and saved Clara's future, but in doing so, he had revealed depths of character and capability that transformed everything she thought she knew about their relationship. "Well," she said finally, "this has been an educational afternoon." Li Wei smiled, and for a moment he was simply the man who had tended her roses and taught her niece to paint beautiful words. Educational is one way to describe it. "Uncle Wei," Clara tugged at his sleeve, "are you really an important person from China?" "I was once upon a time, but now I'm just someone who cares very much about you and your aunt." "Good," Clara said firmly. "I like you better as Uncle Wei than as an important person." As Evelyn watched Li Wei kneel to hug the child, she realized that Clara had captured something profound in her innocent wisdom. Titles and positions were external things, easily lost or gained. What mattered was the heart that had chosen to protect them, the courage that had risked everything for love, and the man who had proven that sometimes the most valuable treasures came disguised as the most ordinary gifts. The telegraph key sat silent now, its urgent messages delivered and answered. But the real communication had been much simpler, the unspoken understanding between two people who had found in each other the strength to build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate pasts. The courthouse in Larkspur Ridge had never hosted proceedings of such gravity or witnessed such an unlikely assembly of participants. Federal Judge Harrison, specially appointed to hear the case against Thomas Hartwell, presided over a courtroom packed with railroad workers, Chinese immigrants, territorial officials, and curious townspeople who had come to see justice served or scandal confirmed, depending on their inclinations. Evelyn's signature seal lay before the judge as evidence not of her guilt, but of her transformation. The ornate silver stamp that had once marked countless contracts for Chinese labor had been used that morning to sign documents establishing the first legal protection fund for immigrant workers in the territory. It was a fitting symbol of how completely her understanding of power and responsibility had evolved. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Williams began, addressing the court with the measured tones of a man who had spent weeks preparing a case that had seemed unwinnable until Li Wei's dramatic intervention. "The evidence will show that Thomas Hartwell engaged in a deliberate conspiracy to destroy Mrs. Van Cleef's reputation and business interests through the fabrication of federal crimes and the forging of diplomatic documents." Hartwell sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, a nervous man from San Francisco who had arrived too late to do anything but damage control. The railroad baron's usual confidence had evaporated over the past week as witness after witness came forward to testify about his various illegal activities and threats. "Furthermore," Williams continued, "the defendant's actions were motivated not by patriotic concern for territorial security, but by greed and a desire to eliminate business competition. He sought to use anti-Chinese sentiment as a weapon to destroy an American citizen who had committed no crime other than treating her employees with dignity and fairness." Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver whiskers who had built his reputation on careful attention to facts rather than political expedients, listened with obvious interest as the prosecution laid out their case. The presence of Chinese diplomatic officials in his courtroom was unprecedented, but their testimony had been devastating to Hartwell's defense. The prosecution calls Mrs. Evelyn Van Cleef. Evelyn rose with the composure that had carried her through 3 years of business challenges and personal loss. She had dressed carefully for this moment, not in the black of mourning that had become her trademark, but in deep blue silk that spoke of strength and renewal. As she took the witness stand, her eyes found Li Wei in the gallery, drawing courage from his steady presence. "Mrs. Van Cleef," Williams began, "please tell the court about your first encounter with the defendant's allegations. Mr. Hartwell came to my home with what he claimed were concerns about my loyalty to American interests. He suggested that my employment of Chinese workers and my relationship with Li Wei constituted suspicious activity. And how did you respond?" "I told him that my business practices were guided by efficiency and fairness, not by racial prejudice. I also made it clear that I would not participate in his scheme to destroy the Chinese settlement for railroad expansion." "Did Mr. Hartwell threaten you?" Evelyn chose her words carefully. "He suggested that my refusal to cooperate might lead to uncomfortable scrutiny from federal authorities. At the time, I thought he was bluffing." "When did you realize the seriousness of his threats?" "When Sheriff Morrison showed me the forged documents that purported to prove I was selling information to Chinese agents. The papers were sophisticated forgeries, but they contained details about my personal and business affairs that could only have come from someone who had been systematically investigating me for months." Defense attorney McMahon rose for his cross-examination, clearly hoping to find some weakness in Evelyn's testimony. "Mrs. Van Cleef, isn't it true that you have unusual relationships with Chinese nationals that might appear suspicious to reasonable observers?" "I have business relationships with Chinese workers, just as I have business relationships with Irish, German, and American workers. If treating people fairly, regardless of their national origin, appears suspicious, then I fear for the future of American ideals." "But your relationship with the man known as Li Wei goes beyond normal employer-employee interactions, does it not?" Evelyn felt the courtroom's attention focus on her with laser intensity. This was the moment she had known would come the public acknowledgement of feelings that society would consider scandalous, inappropriate, perhaps even treasonous. "Yes," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "Li Wei and I have developed a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. If that constitutes a crime, then I stand guilty as charged." The simple dignity of her admission seemed to catch McMahon off guard. He had clearly expected either denial or embarrassed evasion, not this straightforward acknowledgement of unconventional love. "Mrs. Van Cleef, are you aware that such relationships are viewed with suspicion by many in this community?" "I'm aware that fear and prejudice often masquerade as virtue, yes. But I'm also aware that the greatest partnerships in history have been built by people who had the courage to look beyond surface differences, to find deeper truths." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Van Cleef, the court is interested in facts, not philosophy. Do you deny that your relationship with Li Wei influenced your business decisions regarding Chinese workers?" "I don't deny it, Your Honor. Knowing Li Wei helped me understand that Chinese workers are not just units of labor, but human beings with families, dreams, and rights that deserve protection. If that knowledge influenced my business decisions, then I'm grateful for it." "And you maintain that this understanding never led you to provide information to foreign agents or act against American interests?" "I maintain that protecting the rights of American residents, regardless of their national origin, is the most patriotic thing any of us can do." As Evelyn left the witness stand, she felt the weight of the community's judgment settling around her like a cloak. Some faces in the gallery showed support and admiration, while others reflected the disapproval and suspicion she had expected. But for the first time in her adult life, she felt no need to compromise her principles for the sake of social acceptance. Li Wei would testify next, and she knew that his words would either complete their vindication or seal their fate. But whatever the outcome, she had spoken her truth with the clarity and courage that Jonathan would have admired and that Clara would someday understand. The signature seal gleamed on the evidence table, no longer a symbol of exploitation but of transformation, proof that even the most entrenched systems could be changed by people willing to risk everything for the sake of justice and love. The train ticket to San Francisco lay in Li Wei's jacket pocket like a promise of freedom and a symbol of choice. One-way passage to the city where Chen Weiming had assured him a position waited in the Chinese consulate, safety, respect, and a return to the diplomatic world where his education and experience would be valued without question. All he had to do was board the evening train and leave Larkspur Ridge behind forever. But as he took the witness stand in the packed courtroom, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, Li Wei knew that some choices transcended personal safety. The woman he loved sat in the gallery, her face serene despite the scandals swirling around her. Clara sat beside her, the jade pendant visible at her throat, a tangible reminder of the family bonds that had grown stronger than blood or law. "State your name for the record," Prosecutor Williams requested. "Li Wei, formerly Li Weiming, of Guangzhou Province, China, former attaché to the Imperial Diplomatic Mission in San Francisco." The admission caused a stir in the courtroom. Even those who had heard rumors about his background were struck by the formal declaration of his true identity and position. "Mr. Li Wei, how did you come to be in Larkspur Ridge?" Li Wei's voice carried the measured tones of someone who had testified before government officials in 2 countries. "My family fell into debt due to business failures and medical expenses. To honor those obligations, I accepted a labor contract that was later transferred to private individuals for collection." "You were sold to pay debts?" "In effect, yes, though I understood the arrangement to be temporary employment to satisfy financial obligations." "How did you come to work for Mrs. Van Cleef?" "She purchased my contract at a labor auction. I was assigned household duties at her estate." Williams moved closer to the witness stand. "Mr. Li Wei, during your time in Mrs. Van Cleef's household, did she ever ask you to provide information about Chinese community activities to foreign agents?" "Never." "Did she ever request that you translate sensitive business documents for transmission to China?" "No. Mrs. Van Cleef's communications with Chinese workers were limited to employment matters and charitable initiatives. Yet the defendant has alleged that you served as a go-between for espionage activities." Li Wei turned to look directly at Hartwell, his gaze steady and uncompromising. "Mr. Hartwell's allegations are fabrications designed to justify the seizure of Chinese community property and the elimination of Mrs. Van Cleef as a business rival." Defense attorney McMahon rose for cross-examination, his strategy clearly focused on undermining Li Wei's credibility through his hidden identity. "Mr. Li Wei, you've admitted to concealing your true background from Mrs. Van Cleef and this community. How can we trust anything you say?" "I concealed my diplomatic experience because I believed it would make me a target for exactly the kind of persecution Mr. Hartwell has orchestrated. My goal was to live quietly and earn honest wages, not to engage in espionage or political activities." "But you maintained contact with Chinese government officials." "I maintained personal friendships with former colleagues, yes, just as any immigrant might correspond with friends and family in his homeland. And these friends were able to provide very convenient testimony to support your story." Li Wei's expression remained calm. "These colleagues were able to verify the authenticity of forged documents and expose lies told about Chinese government activities. If you consider truth convenient, then yes, their testimony was very convenient indeed." McMahon pressed harder. "Mr. Li Wei, isn't it true that your relationship with Mrs. Van Cleef goes far beyond that of employee and employer?" The question hung in the courtroom air like morning mist, and Li Wei felt the moment of ultimate choice arrive. He could deflect, minimize, or deny the relationship that had become the center of his world. It would be safer, more pruditic, more likely to result in legal victory. Instead, he chose truth. "Yes, Mrs. Van Cleef and I have developed a relationship based on mutual respect, shared values, and deep affection. She has treated me not as property or a servant, but as a human being worthy of dignity and consideration. In return, I have given her my loyalty, my protection, and my love." The simple honesty of his declaration seemed to silence the courtroom. Even McMahon appeared taken aback by the directness of the admission. "And you maintain that this relationship never compromised your judgment or hers. Our relationship has made both of us better people. Mrs. Van Cleef has become more aware of the humanity of her workers. I have learned that love can transcend the boundaries that society tries to impose. Neither of these changes constitutes a crime." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Li Wei, you understand that your testimony today, combined with your public acknowledgement of this relationship, makes it unlikely that you'll be accepted by many in this community." Li Wei's hand moved unconsciously to his jacket pocket, feeling the train ticket that represented escape from judgment and rejection. "I understand, Your Honor, but I also understand that some things are more important than social acceptance, such as truth, justice, love, the protection of innocent people who have committed no crime other than being different." Li Wei looked toward Clara, whose young face showed nothing but trust and affection. "The responsibility we have to the next generation to leave them a world where character matters more than birthplace. And if the court's decision goes against you and Mrs. Van Cleef—" Li Wei met Evelyn's eyes across the courtroom, seeing in them the same resolve that had carried her through widowhood and business battles. "Then we'll face the consequences together, knowing that we chose love over fear, justice over expedience, and truth over lies." As he left the witness stand, Li Wei felt the train ticket in his pocket, not as a promise of escape now, but as a symbol of the choice he had made. San Francisco offered safety and position, but Larkspur Ridge offered something more valuable, a chance to build something meaningful with the woman he loved and the child who had called him uncle. Hartwell's conviction was now certain. The evidence was too overwhelming, the witnesses too credible. But the real trial had been the test of character, the question of whether two people from different worlds could find the courage to choose each other despite the cost. Judge Harrison called for closing arguments, but Li Wei knew that the most important verdict had already been rendered in the quiet moments when he and Evelyn had looked across a courtroom and seen their future reflected in each other's eyes. Not the easy future of social acceptance, but the harder, more beautiful future of two souls who had found their way home. The wedding rings that Evelyn and Li Wei exchanged in the garden of the Van Cleef mansion were not the elaborate creations of San Francisco jewelers, but simple gold bands crafted by Wong Chen, the settlement's metalsmith, from gold that Li Wei had carried in a hidden pouch since leaving China. The ceremony itself was equally unconventional, a blending of Eastern and Western traditions that reflected the unique nature of their union. 6 months had passed since Thomas Hartwell's conviction and imprisonment for conspiracy, forgery, and fraud. The railroad baron's empire had crumbled under federal investigation, revealing a network of corruption that extended far beyond his persecution of Evelyn and the Chinese community. His downfall had sent ripples through territorial politics, opening space for more ethical approaches to westward expansion. Judge Harrison, who had presided over Hartwell's trial with such fairness, had surprised everyone by agreeing to perform the wedding ceremony. His presence lent official dignity to an occasion that some still viewed with suspicion, but his decision reflected the changing attitudes that had emerged from the trial's revelations. "Dearly beloved," the judge began, his voice carrying across the garden where roses bloomed in abundance under Li Wei's careful tending. "We are gathered here to witness the union of two people who have shown us that love knows no boundaries of race, nationality, or social convention." Clara stood beside Evelyn as maid of honor, wearing a dress of pale yellow silk and the jade pendant that had become her most treasured possession. At 8 years old, she barely understood the significance of the ceremony, but she glowed with the happiness of a child whose family was finally becoming complete. The Chinese community had turned out in full force, grateful to the woman who had protected their homes and the man who had risked everything to save them. Elder Zhang stood with tears in his eyes, remembering other weddings in distant provinces where families had been united across traditional boundaries. Martha had wept openly when Evelyn asked her to serve as witness, honored to be included in a ceremony that represented everything she had hoped for her employer: a chance to love again, to build a future based on joy rather than mere survival. Li Wei, Judge Harrison continued, do you take Evelyn to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Li Wei replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. He slipped the ring onto Evelyn's finger with hands that had once painted imperial documents and now tended roses with equal skill. I promise to honor your strength, cherish your kindness, and stand beside you as we build a life worthy of the love we share. And do you, Evelyn, take Li Wei to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live. Evelyn looked into Li Wei's dark eyes, seeing reflected there the journey they had traveled together from that first moment at the labor auction to this morning of promise and possibility. I do. I promise to respect your wisdom, treasure your gentleness, and walk beside you as we create something beautiful from the joining of our different worlds. As they kissed to seal their vows, the assembled guests broke into applause that echoed across the valley. Chinese workers and American railroad men, territorial officials and immigrant families, all united in celebration of a love that had overcome prejudice and persecution to bloom like the roses in Evelyn's garden. The reception that followed was a feast unlike anything Larkspur Ridge had ever witnessed. Tables groaned under the weight of both American and Chinese dishes, prepared by Martha working alongside women from the settlement who had taught her secrets of seasoning and preparation. Children ran between the tables, playing games that mixed English and Mandarin words with equal enthusiasm. Mrs. Li, Martha said, testing out the new name with obvious delight. I don't think I've ever seen you look so happy. Evelyn smiled, watching as Li Wei taught a group of children the calligraphy symbols for joy and luck. I feel like I'm seeing the world clearly for the first time in years, Martha. All the things I thought mattered, social position, business success, other people's approval, they seem so small now compared to this. And what is this? Family, community, the knowledge that we can change things, make them better. Evelyn gestured toward the mixed crowd of celebrants. 6 months ago, most of these people would never have socialized together. Now look at them. Indeed, the barriers that had once seemed insurmountable were crumbling as neighbors discovered shared humanity beneath surface differences. Railroad supervisors found themselves deep in conversation with Chinese merchants about trade opportunities. American women exchanged recipes with immigrant wives. Children played together with the easy acceptance that adults struggled to achieve. As evening approached and lanterns were lit throughout the garden, Li Wei found a moment to speak privately with his new wife. They stood together beneath the ancient oak tree, where he had first tended the roses, surrounded by the fragrance of jasmine and the soft murmur of contented guests. Do you have any regrets? He asked softly. Evelyn considered the question seriously. Her marriage to Li Wei had indeed cost her some business relationships and social connections. Several investors had withdrawn their support, and some of Larkspur Ridge's respectable families no longer included her in their social gatherings. But these losses seemed insignificant beside the gains. None, she said firmly, though I do wonder what Jonathan would have thought of all this. Li Wei smiled, looking up at the portrait that was now permanently displayed in the parlor, watching over their daily lives with painted eyes full of warmth. I think he would have been proud of the woman you've become, and grateful that someone was able to help you remember how to live again. What about you? Do you miss your diplomatic career? I miss the intellectual challenges sometimes, but I found something more fulfilling here, the chance to build rather than merely negotiate, to teach rather than simply translate. He gestured toward Clara, who was showing some of the other children how to paint Chinese characters with sticks in the garden soil. Besides, I suspect our daughter will provide plenty of intellectual stimulation as she grows up. Our daughter, Evelyn repeated, savoring the words. I like the sound of that. Clara ran up to them at that moment, her dress grass-stained and her face bright with excitement. Mama Evelyn, Papa Wei, Elder Zhang wants to teach everyone the dragon dance. Can we do it? Please. The casual way the child used their new family titles brought tears to both adults' eyes. Clara had lost her birth parents to accident and disease, but she had gained something equally precious, a family built on choice rather than mere blood, strengthened by shared values rather than simple genetics. Of course we can, Evelyn said, taking Clara's hand. We're part of this community now, all of it. As the evening progressed into a celebration that would be remembered in Larkspur Ridge for decades to come, Evelyn found herself thinking about transformation, how a purchase made in spite at a labor auction had become the foundation for a love that changed everything it touched, how a Chinese scholar's fall from grace had become an American family's rise to hope, how two broken people had found in each other the strength to heal not just themselves, but their entire community. The rings on their fingers caught the lantern light as Li Wei and Evelyn joined the dragon dance, following the sinuous line of celebrants through the garden that had become a symbol of what could grow when different cultures met with mutual respect rather than suspicion. Behind them, Martha cleared dishes with the help of new friends from the settlement, her weathered face bright with satisfaction at seeing her beloved employer finally, completely happy. Above them, stars emerged in the darkening sky, bearing witness to vows that had been made not just between two people, but between two worlds learning to become one. In the morning, there would be practical matters to address the railroad business to run more ethically, the Chinese community's legal protections to strengthen, Clara's education to continue. But tonight was for celebration, for gratitude, for the quiet wonder of two souls who had found their way home to each other across the vast distances of culture, language, and loss. The jade pendant around Clara's neck caught the light as she laughed, and somewhere in that gleam was the blessing of Li Wei's grandmother, the approval of Jonathan's generous spirit, and the promise that love, when it is true and brave and patient, can indeed change the world.